For my presentation, I'm going to be doing it on the smallpox virus. The origins of the smallpox virus is unknown. However, scientists believe that it could be older than 12,000 years old. Some of the oldest documentation that we have is in a mummy, Pharaoh Ramses V, who had smallpox over 3,000 years ago. In this photo here, you can see small little red dots on his face. And the way that they were able to tell that it was smallpox is from DNA sampling, and also because it has indentions in it. And that was a good way that they could tell that it was smallpox. Smallpox throughout history. So as trade and global expansion began, the smallpox virus began to spread as well. In the 6th century, China, Korea brought it to Japan. In the 7th century, India now had the smallpox virus. In the 10th century, it has spread through the Asia Minor, which is now known as Turkey. And in the 11th century, Europe now had smallpox. And through the 11th century to the 17th century, Europe began to spread it throughout the entire world. And in the 17th century, it made its way to America. So how do we control the spread? Smallpox is caused by an orthopox virus, and it killed 3 out of every 10 people that it infected. Those that did survive were left with scars from the pustulars that were left after they scabbed over and fell off. So we had to come up with a method of how we could, in a way, slow down the spread of smallpox. So the first method we came up with was virilation. And virilation is basically where they took the smallpox spores and they exposed it to someone that had never been infected with smallpox. They did this by putting it on their arm or through inhaling it through the nose. And what happened was they would develop symptoms like smallpox, like a rash and fever. However, the symptoms and the smallpox would be milder and they would become immune to it. And it saved a lot of lives because the symptoms were not as bad as actually having the smallpox virus. In 1796, a man named Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had gotten cowpox became protected from getting the smallpox. And he was curious about this. So Jenner took some material from the cowpox spores, and then he introduced it into an arm of a child that had never had smallpox before. He let a few months go by, and then he would expose the child to the variola virus, which is the smallpox. And the child never developed smallpox. What happened was his body was able to create antibodies from the cowpox spores. And because the cowpox spores and the cowpox virus was actually a weaker version of and similar to the smallpox virus, he became immune to the smallpox virus. So he didn't get the awful symptoms that smallpox virus causes. And from Edward Jenner figuring this out, he was able to create vaccines and give us a fighting chance against this disease. So in 1959, the World Health Organization, the WHO, decided that they had a plan to eradicate smallpox from the planet. However, there was a few setbacks in this plan. They lacked funding, they lacked commitment from other countries, and they lacked a shortage of vaccine donations. And from this happening, in 1966, there was a major outbreak happening across South America, Africa, and Asia. And in 1967, they said, we got to do something about this. So for the next 10 years, 1967 to 1977, they came up with the Intensified Eradication Program, which basically had one goal, and that was to eradicate smallpox from the planet. And they accomplished this. And 1977, the last person acquired the smallpox virus. And they announced at the 33rd World Health Assembly on May 8th, 1980, that the world was now free of the smallpox virus. And all of this is thanks to Edward Jenner nearly 2 centuries before this, whenever he found out and gave us the vaccine to smallpox. Yes, we still do have some smallpox in reserves. Right now, there is currently 2 locations that is publicly known, and that is in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and in Russia. So they decided that they were not going to destroy every single last known strand of the virus, as they would possibly need it in the future if there's ever another outbreak of the smallpox virus or maybe something similar to it. And so that we could have something to base it off of to give us a fighting chance. And they also had it so that they could continue studying how it worked and what other things that they could possibly learn from it. So now let's talk about what happens when you actually get the smallpox virus. So the incubation period lasts 7 to 19 days, and it's not contagious. The initial symptoms last around 2 to 4 days, and they can be contagious sometimes, but not often. The early signs is a rash and scabs, and they develop a high fever, head, and body aches, and sometimes vomiting. When the rash begins, and it lasts about 4 days, it's highly contagious. Smallpox is spread through person-to-person contact. So that's body fluids, respiratory, and it gets inside you and spreads. It begins in the mouth and on the tongue, and small red spots begin to form. And then they begin to change, the spots begin to change into spores, and eventually they burst open and it spreads the virus throughout the body. And then the rash begins to appear on the skin. So it begins on the face, and it spreads to the arms, the legs, and then to the hands and feet. Within 24 hours, the entire body is completely covered with the rash. As the rash appears, the fever begins to decline, and the person may begin to feel better. However, by the 4th day of the infection, that rash begins to form sores, and those sores begin to fill with fluid. And the sores, as you can see in this picture, have a little dent in them. And that's a way that they can tell it's smallpox. And then the sores become filled with fluids. The fever begins to rise once again, and it remains high until the scabs form over. The height of the infection lasts about 10 days, and it's still contagious. The sores become pustulars, which are raised red round bumps. And after about 5 days, pustulars begin to form a crust and then scab. And by day 6, all the spores are pustulars. Here's a picture of a child that has smallpox. As you can see, it looks very painful, and it's covering the entire body. And then the infection begins to subside. This lasts about 6 days, and it's still contagious. The scabs begin to fall off, and it leaves a mark on the skin. Could become a scar. By week 3, most scabs have fallen off, and by the 4th week, all the scabs have fallen off, and the person is no longer contagious. So prevention is simple. Get the smallpox vaccine, also known as the vaccina virus vaccine. The vaccines are made from a virus called vaccina, which is similar to the pox virus, but less harmful. How the vaccine works. So it works if you have never contracted the virus before, then the vaccine is going to give you complete protection from getting sick. If you're exposed and within 3 days get the vaccine, you're going to have little symptoms. It's going to give you protection, and you may not get the virus. If you get it within 4 to 7 days from being exposed, the vaccine will help you just a little bit. And once you develop a rash, the vaccine no longer helps you. Currently, the smallpox vaccines are no longer available for the general public because the virus no longer exists. But if there's ever an outbreak, the United States has confirmed to us that there is enough vaccines to be given to every American that would need one. As you can see, the smallpox virus is very deadly and has a very long history. But thankfully, from Edward Jenner, we were given a fighting chance to now we can say that the smallpox virus is no longer on this planet. Thank you.